Galactic Assembly leaders expected humanity to beg for mercy when the banishment vote passed. They anticipated desperate pleas, diplomatic begging, and the bowing of heads. Instead, the human ambassador simply adjusted his tie, tapped his microphone, and smiled with cold, absolute certainty. "Terms accepted," he said. And then he read them the bill. The chime of the voting sequencer was a soft, synthetic bell. It sounded entirely too polite for an execution. Ronald sat with his hands folded on the cold, obsidian surface of the Terran desk. Above him, the grand rotunda of the Concordat Assembly stretched into a vaulted ceiling, painted with constellations humanity had bled to chart for them. The holographic tally hung heavy in the center of the room. 412 red spheres, 8 green. It was done. Next to him, his adjutant, Lucas, exhaled a long, slow breath. The sound was swallowed by the cavernous acoustics of the chamber. "They actually did it!" "I told you they would," Ronald said. His voice was a flat, dry rasp. He didn't feel rage. He didn't feel the sting of betrayal. He just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. Across the vast amphitheater, the presiding magistrate rose. He was a tall, rigid creature, draped in the silken robes of the core worlds. His species prided themselves on logic and stoicism, yet Ronald could see the faint, self-satisfied tremor in the magistrate's hands. "The tally is finalized," the magistrate's voice echoed, translated by the tiny earpiece in Ronald's right ear into a crisp, emotionless English. "By an overwhelming majority, the Terran systems are hereby found in violation of the core accords. Your expansionist tendencies, your refusal to adhere to the designated caste quotas, and your aggressive cultural nature have been deemed a contaminant to the peace of the Concordat." A low murmur of approval rippled through the tiered seating. Hundreds of delegates, hundreds of worlds. "Effective immediately, the Terran systems are stripped of their council seat," the magistrate continued, his tone rising with theatrical finality. "Your trading privileges are revoked. Your borders are sealed. You are banished from the protection of the Concordat. May the void have mercy on your isolation." Silence descended on the room. It was a heavy, expectant quiet. They were waiting. Ronald knew exactly what they wanted. He had read the psychological profiles compiled by Earth's intelligence. The Assembly viewed humanity as upstart children, loud, messy, and desperate for approval. They expected Ronald to stand up and shout. They expected him to slam his fists on the desk, to threaten war, or worse, to beg for a transition period. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the brutes of the galaxy grovel for the scraps of civilization. Ronald unclasped his hands. He stood up. He didn't rush. He took a moment to adjust the cuffs of his grey suit. He picked up his datapad. He walked down the curved, carpeted stairs toward the central podium. The silence stretched, turning brittle. When Ronald reached the podium, he didn't look up at the magistrate. He looked at the datapad. He tapped the screen once, waking it up. Then he leaned into the microphone. "The Terran systems acknowledge the vote," Ronald said. His voice was calm, conversational, and entirely devoid of the desperation they were waiting for. "We accept the terms of our banishment. Completely." A confused mutter fluttered through the avian delegates in the third tier. The magistrate frowned, leaning forward. "Ambassador, you understand that this means absolute severance. No aid, no trade, no military support." "I understand perfectly," Ronald said, finally looking up. His eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of species after species. "You called us a contaminant. You called us aggressive. You said we don't fit into your neat, orderly quotas. And you're right. We don't. Ronald rested his hands on the edges of the podium. When we joined this assembly 40 years ago, we were told this was an alliance of mutual prosperity. But we quickly learned what you actually wanted. You didn't want partners. You wanted janitors. You wanted someone to mine the asteroid belts you found too dangerous. You wanted someone to patrol the fringe territories you found too hostile. You wanted our sweat, our blood, and our industrial capacity. But you didn't want us sitting at your dinner table. Ambassador, this rhetoric is pointless, the magistrate interrupted, though a hint of unease had crept into his translated voice. The vote is cast. It's not rhetoric, it's an invoice, Ronald replied smoothly. You voted for absolute severance. You voted to remove the contaminant, so we are removing ourselves. But humanity does not do things by halves. If we are no longer part of the Concordat, then the Concordat is no longer entitled to Terran labor, Terran technology, or Terran lives. Ronald looked back at his desk. Lucas, initiate Protocol Archangel. At the Terran desk, Lucas didn't hesitate. He brought his hand down on his console, entering a 12-digit authorization code. He pressed execute. A soft chime rang through the chamber. This one wasn't from the voting sequencer. It came from the massive, curved display screens that lined the walls of the rotunda, the screens that tracked the real-time logistics, military movements, and economic lifeblood of the galaxy. What is this? The magistrate demanded. This, Ronald said, his voice dropping an octave, is humanity making our rules clear. The great screens surrounding the assembly floor flared white, then shifted. The complex, glowing web of galactic hyperlanes, trade routes, and military blockades appeared. For decades, it had been a comforting sight to the politicians, a testament to their vast, ordered empire. Now, the map was changing. Rule 1 of our banishment, Ronald said, his voice echoing over the rising panic in the room. We take what is ours. When we joined the Concordat, your hyper-relay network was failing. Your engineers couldn't stabilize the dark matter cores. Ours could. We built the Apex relays. We maintained them. On the screens, thousands of bright blue nodes suddenly blinked red, then went entirely dark. Shouts erupted from the lower tiers. The representative of the mercantile guilds leaped to his feet, his translation collar spitting out frantic, high-pitched static before rendering into English. The outer rim relays. They're powering down. Our cargo fleets. They'll be stranded in deep space. They are Terran property, Ronald said coldly. We are remotely shutting down all human-manufactured stabilization cores. You have 30 standard hours of residual charge to get your ships to a safe harbor. After that, the lanes collapse. Build your own relays. You can't do this, the magistrate barked, his stoicism entirely evaporated. He was gripping the railing of his platform. Millions of citizens rely on those routes for basic sustenance. The agricultural shipments. Rule 2, Ronald cut in, refusing to yield the floor. Charity is for allies. For 40 years, the bread baskets of the Terran colonies have fed your overpopulated core worlds at subsidized rates. Because we believed in the alliance. Because we believed in helping our neighbors. Ronald pointed a finger directly at the magistrate. But you just told us we have no neighbors. You told us we are banished. So the subsidies are gone. As of 1 minute ago, all Terran agricultural fleets have been ordered to dump their Concordat cargo at the nearest neutral gravity well and return home. You want to eat? Learn to farm. The chamber descended into chaos. The polite, sterile environment was shattered by the raw, primal noise of 100 species realizing their throats had just been cut. They had voted on a political abstraction. They had voted to punish a disobedient child. They hadn't realized the child was holding up the ceiling. Order! "Order in the chamber!" the magistrate screamed, slamming his fist against his podium. The gavel chime rang out repeatedly, ignored by the panicked delegates. Ronald stood perfectly still in the storm, an island of calm. He waited for the noise to drop just a fraction, leaning into the microphone so his voice boomed over the pandemonium. And finally, Rule 3. The sheer weight of his tone cut through the panic. The delegates slowly quieted, turning their wide, terrified eyes back to the human at the podium. "Defense," Ronald said. On the giant screens, the tactical overlay shifted. The glowing perimeter of the Perseus Arm, a notoriously volatile sector, bordering hostile, unaligned territories, came into focus. For a decade, it had been secured by a solid, impenetrable wall of blue icons. The Terran 7th Fleet. "You called us violent. You called us warmongers," Ronald said, the cynicism bleeding into his voice now, sharp and bitter. "Because we maintain the largest standing military in the galaxy. You mocked our paranoia. You sat in your core worlds, safe and insulated, and voted to condemn our aggressive nature." Ronald looked to Lucas and gave a single nod. On the screen, the blue icons began to move. They weren't holding the line. They were turning around. "The Terran 7th, 9th, and 3rd Fleets are currently breaking orbit," Ronald announced. "They are abandoning the Perseus defensive line. They are returning to Terran space to secure our borders." A horrified gasp sucked the air out of the room. "The fringe syndicates," a delegate from a border world whispered, his voice trembling so violently his translator could barely process it. "Without the human fleets, the syndicates will overrun us in a matter of weeks. The pirates, the slavers, yes, they probably will," Ronald said. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold, hard truth. "You wanted to be free of human aggression. Congratulations. You are now solely reliant on the concordate peacekeeper forces. I'm sure their ceremonial armor will hold up wonderfully against syndicate plasma fire." The magistrate's face was the color of ash. The political theater was dead. The reality of the banishment was crushing him, suffocating him. He reached out a hand, his voice dropping the commanding boom, reducing to a frantic, wavering plea. "Ambassador Cole, please. This is an extreme overreaction. We can negotiate a phased withdrawal, a 10-year transition plan to allow the concordate to—" "No." Ronald's voice struck like a hammer. "You don't get to blindfold the executioner and then complain about the swing of the axe. You held the vote. You passed the resolution. The Terran systems are officially a rogue state. We are banished." Ronald picked up his datapad. He turned his back on the magistrate, looking up at the terrified faces of the assembly. "Our borders are now closed. Any concordate military vessel entering Terran space will be fired upon without warning. Any political envoy will be turned away. You wanted a galaxy without us. You have it." Ronald walked away from the podium. He didn't look back. As he and Lucas walked up the aisle, the sound of their heavy footsteps echoed through the chamber, marking the rhythm of an empire's collapse. The assembly had wanted to teach humanity a lesson in humility. Instead, humanity had just taught them a lesson in survival, and the void, as the magistrate had so eloquently put it, was not going to have mercy on them. 7 months later, the void was no longer quiet. It was screaming. Admiral Aurora Hayes stood on the observation deck of the Terran dreadnought Spear of Geneva, her hands clasped behind her back. Beyond the reinforced armor glass, the darkness of space was peppered with the cold, unblinking light of the Terran blockade. Hundreds of warships parked in a perfect, impenetrable sphere around human space. They hadn't fired a single shot in over half a year. They hadn't needed to. The slaughter was happening on the other side of the line. "Report from the Perseus sector, ma'am," her communications officer called out. The young lieutenant sounded tired. They all were. Watching a galaxy burn from the front row took a toll on the soul. "Put it on the glass," Hayes ordered. The stars faded, replaced by a tactical projection of the neighboring concordate territories. It was a mess of red hazard icons and distress beacons. 7 months ago, those sectors had been a pristine blue. Then, the Terran 7th Fleet had packed up and left. The syndicates hadn't waited a week. Slavers from the Outer Rim, piratical warlords and rogue mercenary outfits had flooded the vacuum. Without human logistics to maintain the hyperlanes, the concordate peacekeepers couldn't deploy fast enough. When they did, their ceremonial cruisers were chewed to pieces by hardened syndicate dreadnoughts. 3 more agricultural worlds in the 4th quadrant just went dark, the lieutenant read from his console. Comms traffic indicates planetary surrender to the Draken cartel. The core worlds are screaming for relief fleets, but, well, there are no relays to guide them. Hayes nodded slowly. And the food riots? Still escalating in the capital systems. Millions dead on Prime alone. They built a society of trillions that forgot how to grow a single stalk of wheat. Without our subsidies, the supply chains collapsed in 90 days. It wasn't a military victory. It was a mathematical execution. Humanity hadn't fired a single kinetic slug at the concordate, but the assembly was bleeding out all the same. You cannot build a castle on the back of a beast of burden, whip the beast, banish it, and expect the castle not to fall. A sudden klaxon shattered the quiet hum of the bridge. Proximity alarms flashed yellow across the deck. "Vessel translating from hyperspace," the tactical officer barked, fingers flying across holographic keys. "Sector Grid 4, right on our doorstep." Hayes narrowed her eyes at the glass. "A syndicate raiding party?" "No, ma'am. Signature is concordate. It's an assembly diplomatic courier, or what's left of one." The image resolved on the main screen. Hayes felt her breath catch. The ship was a mangled wreck. Its pristine white hull was scorched black by plasma burns. One of its nacelles was sheared clean off, venting a freezing trail of atmosphere and coolant into the void. It was limping. "They're broadcasting on all open channels," comms reported. "Unencrypted. Audio only. Ma'am, they're begging." "Put it through," Hayes said. Static hissed over the bridge speakers, followed by a frantic, ragged voice translated into standard English. "Terran blockade. This is the concordate vessel Luminary. We are unarmed. Our life support is failing. We carry an envoy of the High Assembly. Please, we request immediate parley with Ambassador Cole. Please do not fire. We have nowhere else to go." Hayes stared at the ruined ship. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt a deep, hollow pity. "Lock them in a tractor beam. Drag them into the quarantine bay of the station," Hayes commanded. She turned to walk off the bridge. "And get Ronald Cole on the subspace link. Tell him the ghost of the Concordate just showed up at our front door." 2 hours later, Ronald sat in a sterile, grey interrogation room aboard the Aegis border station. He wore the same grey suit he had worn on the day of the vote. He had aged 5 years in 7 months. The logistics of reshaping an entire species' economy overnight had cost him sleep, health, and what little optimism he had left for the universe. The heavy steel door slid open. 2 Terran Marines escorted the alien envoy into the room. It was Magistrate Vaughn, the former head of the Concordate Trade Commission. 7 months ago, Vaughn had been a towering, imposing figure draped in opulent silks, sneering down at Ronald from the tiered seating of the rotunda. Now, the alien looked small. The silks were filthy, stained with grease and dried blood. Vaughn's skin was pale and drawn, the physical signs of severe malnutrition obvious even across species lines. The magistrate shook violently, struggling to stand under the station's standard gravity. Ronald didn't stand up to greet him. He just gestured to the metal chair across the steel table. "Sit down, Vaughn. Before you fall down." Vaughn collapsed into the chair. He looked at Ronald, his eyes wide, terrified, and utterly defeated. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ronald waited. He wasn't going to make this easy. "Ambassador Cole," Vaughn finally whispered. His translator collar was cracked, the English output slightly distorted, giving his voice a mechanical rasp. I thank you for receiving me. You breached a closed border. By our new laws, Admiral Hayes was authorized to turn your ship into dust," Ronald said flatly. "Consider yourself lucky she has a soft heart. Why are you here?" Vaughn closed his eyes. A shuddering breath racked his frail body. "The Concordat is dying." "I know," Ronald replied. "I read the morning briefings. The syndicates took the Perseus arm. Your economy is in freefall. Your core worlds are starving. I warned your assembly this would happen. You voted for it anyway." "We were fools," Vaughn choked out, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "We were arrogant. We believed the infrastructure of the galaxy was a fundamental truth. We didn't understand that it was built on your backs. We didn't see the mortar holding the bricks together until we scraped it out." Vaughn leaned forward, desperation completely overriding his cultural pride. "Ambassador, I have been authorized by the Magistrate Supreme. We are prepared to offer terms of reinstatement." Ronald didn't blink. He just stared at the broken alien. "We will restore your council seat," Vaughn rushed on, speaking rapidly. "We will grant humanity veto power on all military deployments. We will eliminate the caste quotas entirely. You will have unrestricted trade access, tax-exempt, for a century. Please, you have made your point. You have humbled us. Now we need your fleets. We need your engineers. If you do not reopen the relays, the core worlds will consume themselves in a matter of weeks." Vaughn reached into his robes and pulled out a golden data disk, sliding it across the metal table. It stopped inches from Ronald's hands. "The formal surrender of our pride," Vaughn whispered. "Sign it. Bring your fleets back. Save us." Ronald looked at the golden disk. It gleamed under the harsh, utilitarian fluorescent lights of the station. It represented everything humanity had fought for over 40 years. Respect, power, equality among the stars. It was a total, unconditional political victory. Ronald reached out. He picked up the disk, and then he crushed it in his fist. The delicate circuitry snapped with a sharp, brittle crack. Gold casing bent and splintered, cutting into Ronald's palm. He let the pieces fall from his hand. They clattered onto the steel table like dead insects. Vaughn stared at the debris, his jaw slack. What are you doing?" "You misunderstand the situation, Magistrate," Ronald said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "You think this is a negotiation. You think you can put us in timeout, realize your house is on fire, and then offer us a raise to come back and put it out." Ronald leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table. The cynicism he had harbored for decades finally bled into the open. "I told you 7 months ago. You voted for absolute severance. We accepted. The Concordat no longer exists to us." "But millions are dying!" Vaughn cried out, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You are a civilized species. You cannot simply watch the galaxy burn." "We aren't watching it burn," Ronald corrected. "We are watching your empire burn. There is a difference." Ronald pulled his datapad from his jacket and placed it on the table. He tapped the screen, projecting a holographic map of the galaxy between them. "You want to know what humanity has been doing for the last 7 months?" Ronald asked. "We haven't been sulking in the dark. We've been building." He tapped a key. A series of green lines shot out from Terran space, bypassing the Concordat core worlds entirely and linking directly to dozens of independent, suffering colonies on the outer rim. When you banished us, you proved that the Concordat is a failed state, a parasitic entity that only survives by consuming the labor of others. We refuse to attach ourselves to a rotting corpse. Ronald pointed at the green nodes. 2 weeks ago, the planetary governor of Ceti Alpha, one of your fringe agricultural worlds, contacted us. They were starving. The syndicates were days away. They didn't ask the Assembly for help because they knew the Assembly had abandoned them. They asked us. Vaughn stared at the map, trembling. What did you do? We offered them a choice, Ronald said coldly. Secede from the Concordat. Surrender your planetary sovereignty to the Terran systems. In exchange, the Terran 7th Fleet clears your skies of syndicates, and our engineers rebuild your infrastructure. Vaughn's eyes widened in horror. You annexed them. They petitioned for asylum, Ronald corrected sharply. And they aren't the only ones. We have received identical petitions from 42 border worlds in the last month. They are dropping your flags, Vaughn. They are raising ours, because we actually protect our own. The reality of the situation crashed over the alien magistrate. Humanity wasn't returning to the fold. They were replacing it. They were letting the bloated, arrogant core of the Concordat starve to death while they carved out the edges, building a new empire out of the ashes. You are monsters, Vaughn whispered, tears welling in his large, dark eyes. You are letting the core worlds die to conquer the rim. No, Ronald said, his tone softening just a fraction, revealing the heavy, exhausted humanity beneath the steel. We didn't start this fire, Vaughn. You did. You locked yourselves in a vault and threw the key at us. We are just refusing to break the door down. Ronald stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, looking down at the shattered remains of the golden disc. Take this message back to your Magistrate Supreme, Ronald commanded. The Terran systems will not rejoin the Concordat. We will not accept your treaties. We will not stabilize your hyperlanes. The era of human servitude is over. Ronald walked toward the heavy steel door. However, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. If any individual planet wishes to secede from the Concordat Assembly, if they wish to petition the Terran mandate for protection and integration, our communications channels remain open. We will evaluate each request case by case. Vaughn slumped over the table, burying his face in his hands. A low, wretched sob escaped him. It will be the end of our civilization. The core will tear itself apart. Civilizations end, Ronald said quietly, but the people survive, if they are willing to adapt. Ronald stepped out of the interrogation room, the heavy steel door sliding shut behind him, sealing the magistrate inside with his grief. Lucas was waiting in the corridor, holding a fresh cup of synthetic coffee. He handed it to Ronald. How did it go? Exactly as we modeled. Ronald took a long, bitter sip. It tasted like ash, but it kept him awake. They offered us the old world. I told them we're building a new one. Admiral Hayes is requesting orders regarding the luminary, Lucas said, checking his tablet. Should we refuel them? Send them back? Ronald looked down the long metallic corridor of the station. Beyond the bulkhead, 1,000 human warships sat quietly in the dark, their railguns loaded, their crews awake. They were no longer the janitors of the galaxy. They were the architects, and architects didn't build on rotten foundations. Refuel them, Ronald said tiredly. Give them enough provisions to make it back to their core worlds. Let them tell the Assembly exactly what they voted for. Ronald began walking toward the command center, his footsteps echoing in the quiet station. And Lucas? Yes, sir. Tell the 7th Fleet to prep for jump space. SETI Alpha needs a new relay station built, and I want those syndicate ships turned into scrap metal by Tuesday." Ronald smiled, a small, cynical, and deeply human expression. "It's time we start expanding the neighborhood. If you enjoyed this descent into galactic politics, human resilience, and the cold, hard realities of survival, hit that like button to show your support. Humanity doesn't just survive the void. We rewrite the rules. Want to see more gritty, grounded sci-fi stories where Earth stands its ground against the arrogance of the cosmos? Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next transmission.